So this weekend we saw Chavez Jr versus Fonfara. Now, I'm not going to take too much praise here because, as I said in my pre-fight video, it was a slight lean rather than a hugely informed selection. But I picked Fonfara to win this fight. I certainly didn't pick him to win by knockout, but I picked him to win. And Chavez Jr is blaming it on size. Now I think that's interesting because I believe, and I may be wrong on this, that Chavez Jr actually came into the ring 2 pounds heavier than Fonfara. I believe Chavez Jr rehydrated to 185, whereas Fonfara came in at just under 183. It's not impossible I got that wrong, but that's what I've been told. Now, regardless, even if it's the other way around, which I don't anticipate it was about 2 pounds difference. So Chavez Jr blamed the fight afterwards on weight. I thought that was fascinating, seeing as this is a guy who has made a career out of beating up guys who he is 10 pounds heavier than. You know, that is how he has made his career. The combination of being too big for his weight and his father's name. And he's complaining because he's now had to fight someone who's too big. Well, Fonfara wasn't too big. Fonfara is a genuine light heavyweight. And if Chavez has any aspirations to fight a light heavyweight, he needs to be dealing with Fonfara and someone of his size. I thought what was also fascinating is the sense of entitlement from Chavez Jr. Not only did he sort of complain throughout the fight, but afterwards, upon demanding an immediate rematch, he said that he wanted it at 170 because it wasn't fair at 172. Now I appreciate that there's a bit of a language gap here, so I have to give him some credit, but, you know, is the 2 pound weight difference really why you lost this fight, Julio? Is it nothing to do with the fact that you've been out of the ring for ages? Is it nothing to do with the fact that you have been fighting guys too small previously? Is it nothing to do with the fact that you've blown up in weight massively and haven't kept yourself in good condition? Or is it nothing to do with the fact that you've got no boxing fundamentals whatsoever? No ability to jab, no ability to defend? You know, I think if Chavez Jr is blaming it on those 2 pounds, he really needs to go back to the drawing board and reassess. Fonfara, for what it was worth, put in a very good performance, I thought. A really nice boxing skill, you know, performance. In a rematch between Fonfara and Stevenson, with that rematch under his belt, with that experience under his belt, I'd be inclined to look at Fonfara. I presume the Chavez fight is a bigger money match-up for him than a rematch with Stevenson, and I can't imagine he wants too much to do with Sergey Kovalev. So I guess on Chavez's name alone, it's very possible that a rematch will occur here. But I thought Fonfara looked really good. By all accounts, he made the 172 pound catchweight easier than Chavez Jr, which makes me think, I mean, is there any scope for Fonfara to have a serious crack at 168? I mean, look at the performance he put in against Stevenson. The guy's got a chin. You know, he's just dropped Stevenson, knocked out Chavez. The guy can crack a bit. He's got decent fundamentals. I mean, this is a guy who can jab. And, you know, the boxers that I'm seeing in the ring recently, Chavez Jr, Danny Garcia, Ruslan Provodnikov, you know, somebody who can throw a jab puts you ahead of the vast majority of the elite level competition. I mean, Danny Garcia, Ruslan Provodnikov, what's his name, Chavez Jr, how many jabs did they throw between them in their respective recent fights? Fonfara, you know, the guy can box. He came out, he stuck to his fundamentals, he boxed to it, he threw a jab, and essentially he just outclassed and outskilled Chavez Jr. Now the guy's no world beater, but he's just dropped Stevenson, he's just knocked out the unknockable Chavez Jr. Maybe if he's making 172 that easily, he should have a look at super middleweight. Maybe with his frame, his power, he could be a real force to be reckoned with against the smaller guys. I'm interested for anyone who's got any input on that, to you know, who knows the fighter better, to comment. I mean, is Fonfara at 168 a realistic possibility? I don't see Chavez Jr beating him at 170, not at all. Chavez Jr was outclassed. He didn't have a game plan. And whilst he showed heart, you know, getting up, fighting on after being knocked down, The guy quit on his stall because he knew he didn't have what it takes. You know, fundamentally, this is a guy, you know, his best victory on his resume, let's not forget, is Andy Lee. He got absolutely schooled by Martinez. He's just been schooled again. He will be outclassed and outboxed by the elite of the sport. Yeah, Andy Lee, he's a solid enough guy. But Andy Lee, really, in my opinion, is a light middleweight. And Chavez Jr blows up to cruiserweight when he comes in to fight. So that's a typical example of what I mean. So used to like being so much bigger and so much stronger than your opponent. And he's complaining that Fonfara was too big, when effectively they were the same size in the ring. You know, I didn't like that. I didn't like the sense of entitlement. And I just don't think the guy's got boxing fundamentals. I think the only way he goes back to winning big fights is if he can somehow find a way of getting back down to 160 and being 2 weight classes bigger than anyone else. There's a message here about moving up in weight. Yeah, we look at a few fighters recently who've moved up in weight. Yeah, even Amir Khan, he's moved up in weight successfully. But you notice the knockouts aren't coming anymore. You know, Chavez Jr, this is a guy with the iron chin. He's moved up in weight. Not only has he been knocked out, but Fonfara commented that he didn't punch very hard at the weight. Adrian Broner, you know, moves up at the weight and gets stopped. For me, he didn't get stopped, sorry, he gets destroyed en route to a UD against Maidana. I mean, for me, there's a certain kind of fighter you see moving up in weight and succeeding. For me, that kind of fighter is the Bernard Hopkins, the James Toney, the Terence Crawford, the Floyd Mayweather. We see these guys operating in divisions well above where they originally started out. And why is that? It's because they've got sound fundamentals, it's because they can move, it's because they can jab, it's because they can defend. They're not guys reliant on power and reliant on chin. So no matter how good your chin is, if you start fighting guys a stone heavier, a stone and a half heavier than what you're used to, you're not going to be ready for their power. And no matter how hard you hit, even if your name's Sergei Kovalev, if you start moving up a weight class, there are going to be people who hit harder than you. That's just how it is. For me, it's all about styles when you're moving up in weight. Chavez Jr got found out because he's a bully, he's an inside fighter, he's a brawler, he's a body puncher, you know, he's a barroom type fighter. There's a lot to like about him, but this is a guy who doesn't jab, doesn't move and doesn't defend. It's exactly the kind of guy who's going to get exposed when you move up in weight. Yeah, whereas Terence Crawford, because he's so sound, because he can move, he moves up in weight and it's, you know, more of a seamless transition. Canelo Alvarez, Gennady Golovkin. 2 guys who are defensively open in my mind. 2 guys who can be hit. I mean, you get these Golovkin maniacs who tell me that Golovkin's a defensive master. What's that Martin Murray fight? Murray was landing frequently. You know, my point is, people think Golovkin's got an iron chin. Well, people thought Chavez had an iron chin. I appreciate Golovkin's more dedicated to the sport, more disciplined. But Golovkin is a small man for middleweight. Yeah, Canelo Alvarez, I know he's a bit muscular, you know, but he's a small man in terms of frame, you know, he's short for like middleweight. If these guys start moving up in divisions, suddenly, you know, the unthinkable happens. Julio Cesar Chavez, who is known for a granite chin and a huge punch, is being knocked out by Andre Fonfara. He's being called a light puncher. Now, I'm not suggesting that Canelo suddenly becomes a weak puncher at 160 and Golovkin becomes a Paul Smith-style puncher at 168. But what I am suggesting is their power may not be quite so relevant. Just because Golovkin is a devastating puncher at 160, that doesn't necessarily mean he punches harder than George Groves or Mikhail Kessler at 168. In other words, if Golovkin fights a Carl Froch may well be used to being hit as hard as Gennady Golovkin hits. But the one thing we do know is Gennady Golovkin isn't used to in a pro ring being hit as hard as Froch hits. It happened to Chavez, it happened to Broner, it could well happen to Golovkin and Canelo and these type of fighters who are more defensively open and who rely on power if they step up. Yeah, the Terence Crawfords of this world, those absolute slicksters, will always just about get by because they've got the skill to avoid relying on power and relying on chin. Yeah, look at the success James Toney had later in his career. Clearly the guy peaked at middleweight, but even at heavyweight he was able to enjoy some sort of success because of the way he fought and because of the way he won fights. The same cannot be said for Chavez Jr. For me, he's got no future whatsoever at 175. He really doesn't. I don't see him beating a top 10 competitor at 175. Fonfara, credit to him, respect. If he can make 168, he'd be a force. Even at 175, maybe there's scope for him to fight Kovalev, Pascal, a rematch with Stevenson. I was impressed by how he did last time out. I'd like to see him fight again. But for me, the biggest lesson from this Chavez fight, obviously you've got the discipline lesson, not blowing up, not being inactive. But the biggest lesson of all relates to what type of fighters are successful moving up in weight. For me, this is a severe warning for Golovkin, Canelo Alvarez. I know Canelo watches my channel, I know he's a big fan. But if you're watching, I'd consider staying at 154. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks very much for watching. Keen to discuss as always.